Spiritual awakening isn't what people think it is. They imagine light, relief, a beautiful arrival, like you finally made it to the other side. But Jung saw something darker, something most people never talk about, because the awakening doesn't end when you wake up. It begins when you lose the comfort of being asleep. And if you're watching this video, there's a chance you're already inside the most brutal test of spiritual awakening without realizing it. Not a test of faith, not a test of positivity, a test of something far more uncomfortable. A test of whether you can stay conscious when everything inside you is begging for a story that makes the pain go away. Let me tell you what this looks like in real life. You don't necessarily feel spiritual. You feel strange. Your old habits don't satisfy you anymore. Your old conversations feel like noise. Even your victories feel hollow. And what's terrifying is that nothing is visibly wrong. You can still go to work. You can still smile when someone asks, "How are you?" You can still scroll, reply, laugh, and function. But privately, something has changed. It's like your soul stopped believing in the performance, and you start noticing it everywhere, in your friendships, in your relationships, in your ambitions. The same places that used to feel safe now feel staged. So you try to fix it. You watch more videos. You read more books. You search for a label that explains you. You look for a teacher, a method, a sign, because your mind wants certainty. But Jung would say the psyche doesn't awaken by collecting more answers. It awakens when the false parts of you begin to fall away, and you can't glue them back on. And here is the brutal truth. Most people don't fail awakening because they are weak. They fail because they mistake the next phase for a mistake. They think they are breaking. They think they are regressing. They think something is wrong with them. So they do what the human mind is designed to do under pressure. They run back to what's familiar. They rebuild the persona. They reattach themselves to noise. They trade inner truth for belonging. And it doesn't even feel like going back. It feels like surviving. That's why this is a test that almost nobody passes. Because this stage doesn't offer applause. It doesn't offer comfort. It doesn't offer instant relief. It offers something else. Silence. A kind of inner emptiness that makes you question everything, including yourself. And that emptiness has a purpose. In Jungian terms, this is the moment the old identity starts dying, and the deeper self steps forward. But before that happens, something will try to pull you away from it. And that something is you. So here's the question that will decide whether you pass this test or become part of the majority who quietly turn back. Can you stay awake when meaning disappears? Can you remain conscious when you don't know who you are anymore? Because the most brutal test of spiritual awakening isn't the darkness outside you. It's the moment you realize the darkness is asking to be seen. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly what that test is, why it happens, and the hidden reason so many people fail right here, without ever knowing what they lost. Most people imagine spiritual awakening as a sunrise, a clean moment of clarity, a permanent upgrade, the feeling that you finally arrived. In the beginning, it can genuinely look like that. You start noticing patterns you never saw before. You catch yourself mid-reaction, and for the first time you don't automatically obey the old impulse. Awareness feels like power, and that power can be intoxicating, especially if you've spent years repeating the same dynamics, choosing the same kind of pain, and making the same compromises just to keep the peace. So you tell yourself, "That's it. I'm awake now." And in a way, you are. But Jung would quietly warn that this sense of arrival is often the ego's first misunderstanding. Not because the awakening is false, but because the mind immediately tries to turn awakening into a new identity, a new persona you can wear, the aware one, the healed one, the spiritually advanced one. The psyche lets you do this for a while because it gives you momentum, language, and meaning. And meaning is what the ego uses to stay stable. Then something changes, and it rarely changes with drama. It changes subtly, almost invisibly, like a temperature drop you can't explain. One day you wake up, and the excitement is gone. You still understand what you understood yesterday. You haven't lost your insight. But what used to feel like light now feels like weight, because the same awareness that once empowered you becomes a magnifying glass you can't turn off. You notice self-deception in real time. You hear the gap between what people say and what they mean, and you feel the distance between how life looks from the outside and how it actually feels inside you. What's strange is that you don't become more judgmental, you become more sensitive. It's as if your nervous system can't tolerate the old level of pretending anymore, even when the pretending is normal and socially acceptable. You try to return to routine, to the same distractions, the same jokes, the same scrolling, the same surface-level conversations, but nothing lands the way it used to. It's like chewing food that has no taste, and you can't explain why. This is the moment many people begin to panic quietly, because nobody warned them about this phase. They were told awakening brings peace, but what if the first thing it brings is loss? Loss of old pleasures, loss of old comforts, and, more than anything, the loss of the identity that made life feel simple. Jung described this as part of individuation. You don't become whole by gaining a new identity. You become whole by letting false identities collapse, and collapse is never glamorous. Collapse feels like confusion. It can feel like you're regressing, like the world is draining of color, like you're standing in a room where the lights are on but nothing feels alive. So the mind does what it always does when meaning starts to fade. It searches for an explanation, and it often turns the explanation into self-blame. You wonder if you're depressed, ungrateful, broken, too intense, too sensitive, too far gone. But here's the loop most people miss. This emptiness isn't the end of awakening, it's the doorway, and the moment you reach that doorway, the psyche presents you with a choice even if you don't know it yet. You can turn back and rebuild the old self, or you can stay without certainty long enough for something deeper to emerge. And that staying is exactly where the brutal test begins, because the next phase doesn't just remove the world's illusions. It begins removing yours. It brings a withdrawal of meaning, a strange inner silence that can feel like grief. And when we get there, you'll understand why so many people fail right at this point. They call it darkness, they label it a mistake, they medicate it with noise, and they never realize they were standing at the threshold of something Jung believed was necessary for real transformation. At some point, awakening stops feeling like expansion and starts feeling like subtraction. Not because your life collapses outwardly, but because the meaning you once projected onto things quietly withdraws. The job still exists. The relationships still exist. Your routines are intact. Yet something essential has been removed, and no one around you seems to notice that anything is missing. This is one of the most disorienting moments in the entire process. From the outside, you look functional, even stable. From the inside, it feels as if the narrative that once held your life together has dissolved. You can still perform your roles, but you no longer fully believe in them. Conversations sound repetitive. Goals feel strangely artificial. Even the things you worked hard for begin to feel oddly neutral, as if they belong to a version of you that no longer exists. Jung understood this phase as the withdrawal of projections. What once carried emotional charge, status, approval, ambition, identity, loses its grip. Not because those things are evil or meaningless in themselves, but because they were never meant to carry your sense of self. When that energy returns inward, it doesn't arrive as joy. It arrives as emptiness. And emptiness is difficult for the modern psyche to tolerate. We are conditioned to believe that a lack of enthusiasm means something is wrong, that silence is a symptom, and that inner stillness must be filled as quickly as possible. So when meaning withdraws, the mind rushes to interpret it as depression, failure, or loss of direction. You might begin to wonder why nothing excites you the way it used to, why you feel distant even in familiar places, or why being alone feels both necessary and unbearable at the same time. This is where the test sharpens. Because this phase tempts you with an immediate solution, return meaning to the surface. You can do this easily. You can distract yourself with business. You can reattach to old goals. You can adopt a louder identity, a stronger opinion, a more dramatic narrative about who you are and what you believe. The world will gladly support this move. It rewards certainty, productivity, and emotional clarity, even when that clarity is borrowed. But Jung would say that if you rush to refill the space, you interrupt the very process that awakening initiated. The psyche is not empty by accident. It is empty because something true is trying to emerge, and that emergence requires silence, uncertainty, and time. Meaning must be rebuilt from the inside, not imported from the outside. Still, most people don't stay here long enough to discover that. The withdrawal of meaning feels like standing in an in-between world, where the old self no longer fits and the new self hasn't taken shape. There is no clear direction, no emotional reward, no reassuring sign that you are doing it right. And without external validation, the mind becomes restless. It starts bargaining. It asks how long this will last. It looks for proof. It searches for an endpoint. But this stage has no deadline. That is what makes it so difficult. There is nothing to fix, nothing to achieve, nothing to optimize. There is only the experience of not knowing who you are anymore and resisting the urge to immediately replace that not knowing with a convenient answer. And this is precisely where most people fail, not because they lack intelligence or discipline, but because they lack tolerance for emptiness. Yet this emptiness is not the absence of life. It is the absence of illusion. And once illusion withdraws, something else begins to surface. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that quietly reorganizes your inner world. Before that happens, however, the process demands one more thing from you: the ability to remain present without meaning, without identity, and without reassurance. And in the next part, we'll look at why this demand feels so lonely, why awakening often isolates you at this stage, and why Jung believed this loneliness was not a flaw in the process, but one of its most necessary features. In the animal kingdom, there is a moment when certain creatures must separate from the group in order to survive what comes next. A wolf leaves the pack. A snake retreats into isolation to shed its skin. A caterpillar disappears before it becomes something unrecognizable to its former world. This separation is not a punishment. It is a requirement of transformation. Spiritual awakening follows a similar pattern, though it unfolds inwardly rather than in plain sight. After meaning withdraws, you begin to experience a kind of isolation that has nothing to do with being alone physically. You can be surrounded by people and still feel profoundly separate, as if you're observing life from behind a thin pane of glass. Conversations continue, routines remain intact, but the sense of shared reality quietly dissolves. Jung understood this as an inevitable stage of individuation. When the psyche begins reorganizing itself around the self rather than the persona, it temporarily loses its sense of belonging. The structures that once connected you to others, shared goals, shared beliefs, shared illusions, no longer function in the same way. You haven't rejected the world, but you no longer merge with it either. This is why awakening often feels so lonely at this stage. Not because you think you're superior, and not because others have become shallow, but because your inner orientation has shifted. You are no longer unconsciously participating in the same emotional economy. You listen, but something inside you stays quiet. You relate, but something inside you remains untouched. and this creates an uncomfortable tension. On one hand, you still crave connection. On the other, the old forms of connection feel insufficient. Small talk becomes exhausting. Group dynamics feel performative. Even relationships that once felt intimate may start to feel misaligned, not because they are wrong, but because they were built around a version of you that is dissolving. At this point, many people start to doubt themselves. They wonder if they are becoming cold, detached, or emotionally unavailable. They fear they are losing their ability to belong. But Jung would say that this loneliness is not the result of disconnection. It is the result of differentiation. To individuate means to become distinct, and distinction always carries a cost. When you stop unconsciously mirroring the expectations of your environment, you lose the automatic sense of inclusion that came with it. You are no longer fed by constant validation, and you are no longer protected by the comfort of sameness. This is where the test becomes especially cruel, because the loneliness doesn't come with reassurance. No voice appears to tell you this is temporary. No milestone marks your progress. Instead, the psyche places you in a quiet space where you must learn to sit with yourself without reflection, without applause, and without confirmation that you are on the right path. And this is precisely the point where most people turn back. They don't do it dramatically. They don't announce it. They simply begin to adapt themselves again. They soften their perceptions. They laugh a little louder than they feel. They re-enter familiar roles. They tell themselves they were overthinking, going too deep, or taking things too seriously. It feels like relief, but it comes at a cost. Because what is abandoned at this stage is not just discomfort, but the possibility of a deeper, more authentic form of connection, one that can only be built after you learn to stand alone. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the ego is no longer supported by the collective and must learn to orient itself internally. It is a fragile, unstable phase, and it demands a level of inner honesty that few people are willing to tolerate for long. And yet, if you remain here, without retreating, without reshaping yourself to fit back into old containers, something begins to change. The loneliness starts to feel less like exile and more like preparation, not for isolation, but for a different quality of presence. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when the ego senses it is losing control, how it reacts to this isolation, and why this reaction becomes one of the most dangerous traps in the entire awakening process. When the psyche enters this lonely, uncertain space, the ego rarely stays calm. It senses the loss of control long before you consciously understand what's happening, and it will do almost anything to restore stability. That's why Jung warned that the most dangerous moments in inner transformation are not the moments of pain, but the moments when the ego tries to interpret pain as a problem to solve. At this stage, the ego's first defense is to turn awakening into a performance. You start collecting language, concepts, and spiritual labels the way someone might collect armor, not to deepen the process, but to protect yourself from the discomfort of not knowing. You may feel drawn to certainty more than truth, to quick answers more than inner change, and to identities that make the chaos feel organized. Sometimes it looks like obsession with self-improvement. Sometimes it looks like spiritual superiority. Sometimes it looks like constant analysis, as if understanding something intellectually could remove the need to feel it. But the function is the same. The ego is trying to avoid the raw encounter with the unknown. And that's the trap. Because you can appear more awake while actually moving further away from the self. Jung called this a kind of inflation, the ego borrowing the language of transformation to strengthen itself. It is subtle, and it's seductive, because it doesn't feel like denial. It feels like progress. But the deeper work doesn't ask you to build a more impressive identity. It asks you to let identity loosen. So here is a question worth sitting with, because it exposes the ego's defense instantly. Are you using insight to become more honest, or are you using insight to avoid what honesty would cost you? This is where we move into the core of the video, the brutal test itself, because the final trial of awakening is not whether you can learn new truths. It's whether you can remain present when the old truths collapse, and resist the urge to replace them with a comforting illusion. And that is where almost everyone fails. The most brutal test of spiritual awakening isn't pain. It's the moment you realize you can't rely on the old structures anymore, not your identity, not your certainty, not even your usual sources of meaning, and you're forced to stay present anyway. In Jungian terms, this is where the ego is no longer the center of the psyche, but it hasn't accepted that fact yet, so it fights for control with everything it has. Here is the test, in its simplest form. Can you remain conscious without immediately turning your discomfort into a story? Most people can tolerate suffering if they can explain it. If they can name it, justify it, or romanticize it, they feel safe. But this stage removes that safety. It brings you into a space where you don't fully know who you are, and you can't fake your way out without betraying something essential inside you. So the psyche offers two exits. One is noise, distraction, attachment, performance, returning to the familiar persona so you can feel normal again. The other is honesty, staying in the uncertainty long enough for a deeper truth to form without forcing it. That's why so many people fail here. Not because they lack strength, but because they choose relief over reality. They rebuild an identity quickly, they re-enter old roles, and they call it healing, when in fact it's a retreat. Jung would say they chose the persona over the self, and they did it quietly, because this failure doesn't look like collapse. It looks like moving on. But if you stay here, if you don't run, something changes. The emptiness starts to reorganize you. The loneliness becomes clarity. And the life you return to is no longer built on pretending. Now let's talk about why 95% fail this exact stage. The hidden mechanisms that pull people back right when the real transformation is about to begin. So why do 95% fail here? Because this stage doesn't feel like a dramatic breakdown. It feels like an invitation to return to comfort. Jung would say that when the psyche starts pulling energy back from the persona, the ego panics, not because you're doing something wrong, but because the identity you've relied on is no longer being fed by the old rewards, approval, certainty, belonging, and a familiar story about who you are. And the ego is incredibly clever. It will rebuild a version of the old self and call it healing. It will reattach to old roles, old urgency, and old noise, because those things restore immediate stability. In Jungian terms, this is the moment many people choose the persona over the self, not consciously, not dramatically, but quietly, the way someone chooses shallow air when deep water feels too frightening. This is also where Jung's warning about spiritual inflation becomes relevant. The ego can use spiritual language as a shield. You can sound wiser, calmer, even more awakened, while actually avoiding the one thing awakening demands: inner honesty when there is no certainty to hide behind. James Hollis echoes this from a modern psychoanalytic angle. Much of adulthood is spent living inside an adapted identity, what worked, what pleased, what protected, and the real crisis comes when the soul asks for a different life than the ego planned. Hollis would say the question is not how do I feel better, but what is asking to be lived through me now. Because if you keep choosing relief over truth, the psyche doesn't stop speaking. It returns, often later, often louder, and the few who pass don't pass because they are fearless. They pass because they stop negotiating with the truth. They develop tolerance for ambiguity, the capacity to stay present without instantly turning discomfort into a story, a label, or a performance. They let the old identity loosen long enough for something deeper to form, and that's what produces the real reward. Not a constant high, but a grounded wholeness, quiet strength, clean perception, and a life that doesn't require pretending. So here's the final question, the one Jung would recognize as the turning point of individuation. When the old you collapses, will you rebuild the mask, or will you stay long enough to meet what's underneath? If this video described a place you've been, comment, "I won't run." Not as motivation, as a decision. And if you want to keep walking this passage with Jungian clarity, subscribe, because in the next video we'll talk about what happens when the old self refuses to die, and why that resistance is where awakening can quietly turn into suffering.